15,000 years ago, where the skyscrapers of Los Angeles now pierce the California sky, a very different world existed. Mammoths with curved tusks longer than a grown man wandered through grasslands that stretched to the horizon, their deep rumbles carrying for miles across the open landscape. Saber-toothed cats crouched in the shadows of oak woodlands, their 7-inch canines gleaming as they watched herds of ancient horses and camels drift past. Packs of dire wolves, 30 strong, howled at dusk as they prepared for the hunt. And towering above them all, giant ground sloths the size of elephants reached 20 feet into the treetops, pulling down branches with claws longer than kitchen knives. This was North America at the end of the last ice age, a continent teeming with creatures so magnificent they would put any modern safari to shame. More species of large mammals roamed these lands than exist in Africa today, from giant beavers the size of black bears to American lions larger than their African cousins. It was a world of giants, and it had existed in some form for millions of years, surviving ice age after ice age, adapting to climate swings that would reshape entire ecosystems. And then, in what amounts to a single weekend on the geological calendar, they were gone. Within roughly 2,000 years, 32 genera of large mammals vanished from North America. 72% of the continent's megafauna disappeared, leaving behind only bones, footprints frozen in ancient mud, and a mystery that has haunted scientists for over 2 centuries. The mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, the giant sloths, the dire wolves, the American horses and camels and lions, all of them erased from a landscape they had dominated for ages. What happened? What could possibly kill so many different species, spread across an entire continent, in such a catastrophically short span of time? If you had asked scientists this question 50 years ago, you might have received a confident answer. Climate change, they would have told you. The world warmed too quickly at the end of the Ice Age, and these cold-adapted giants simply couldn't cope. Or perhaps human hunters arriving in the Americas for the first time slaughtered naive animals that had never learned to fear a 2-legged predator with a spear. But the truth, as science has slowly revealed, is far more complicated and far more fascinating than either simple explanation. The extinction of the Ice Age giants has become one of the great detective stories of paleontology, a 10,000-year-old crime scene where the evidence points in multiple directions at once, where different continents tell different stories, and where the final verdict remains hotly debated even today. Tonight, we're going to investigate this mystery together. We'll walk among the creatures that once ruled these lands, seeing them not as dusty museum skeletons, but as living, breathing animals that shaped the very ecosystems we inherited. We'll examine the evidence from tar pits that preserved entire communities of Ice Age life, from islands where the last mammoths held on for thousands of years after their mainland cousins had perished, and from ancient DNA that speaks across millennia to tell us things the fossils alone never could. We'll meet the scientists who dedicated their lives to solving this puzzle. There's the controversial figure who blamed human hunters and called the extinction a blitzkrieg. There are researchers who defend climate change as the real culprit. And there are modern teams using cutting-edge genetics to finally untangle the truth. And we'll discover that the answer isn't as simple as picking one suspect over another, that the real story involves a conspiracy of factors, a perfect storm of circumstances that these giants had never faced before in their long evolutionary history. But before we dive into this ancient mystery, if you're finding this journey into deep time interesting, consider subscribing to continue exploring the lost worlds that shaped our own. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, your city, your time zone, whether it's late evening or the small hours of the morning where you are. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, all connected by curiosity about creatures none of us will ever see. Now, to understand what killed these giants, we first need to meet them. To walk among creatures so magnificent that their absence has left holes in ecosystems that remain unfilled to this day. Let us step back 15,000 years to a world that would seem both familiar and utterly alien, and encounter the Ice Age giants on their own terms. To truly understand what was lost, you need to abandon everything you think you know about North American wildlife. Forget the deer and the coyotes, the black bears and the mountain lions. The continent you would have encountered 15,000 years ago bore more resemblance to the Serengeti than to any landscape that exists in the Americas today. A vast grassland ecosystem dominated by creatures that would dwarf nearly anything walking the earth in our time. The undisputed rulers of this world were the proboscideans, the elephant relatives whose bones would later puzzle and astonish the Europeans who dug them from American soil. Two great lineages shared the continent, similar enough to be confused at first glance, but separated by millions of years of evolution and utterly different ways of life. The woolly mammoth is the creature that captures our imagination most completely, and for good reason. Standing 12 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing between 6 and 8 tons, these giants carried tusks that curved dramatically outward and upward, sometimes reaching 15 feet in length. Their bodies were wrapped in a double layer of fur, a coarse outer coat over a dense, woolly undercoat, and beneath their skin lay a 4-inch layer of fat that insulated them against the brutal cold of the glacial world. A fatty hump rose behind their heads, storing nutrients for lean times, much like a camel's hump does today. Their small, fur-covered ears minimized heat loss in the Arctic winds, a stark contrast to the broad, cooling ears of their African relatives. But the mammoth was primarily a creature of the far north, grazing on the grasses of the mammoth steppe that stretched across Alaska and into Siberia. Further south, where the climate was milder, roamed their larger and arguably more impressive cousin, the Columbian mammoth. These animals could exceed 13 feet at the shoulder, making them among the largest land mammals that ever lived. Their tusks were even more massive than those of the woolly mammoth, twisting in elaborate spirals that scientists believe may have served as much for display as for any practical purpose. Recent genetic studies have revealed something remarkable about these two species. They hybridized where their ranges overlapped, their bloodlines mingling across thousands of years in ways that blurred the boundaries between them. Sharing the landscape with the mammoths was a more ancient immigrant, one whose lineage had arrived on the continent long before the mammoths evolved. The American mastodon had walked North American forests for roughly 15 million years, making it a true native in ways the mammoth could never claim. Mastodons were browsers rather than grazers, using their cone-shaped teeth to crush the leaves, twigs and branches of deciduous and conifer trees. They preferred wetland environments, spending their days in swampy forests where they could feed on the lush vegetation that grew along rivers and lake shores. Though slightly shorter than mammoths, mastodons were still enormous animals, standing between 7 and 10 feet at the shoulder and carrying tusks that could reach 16 feet in length. If you had seen both animals side by side, you might have thought them close relatives, but their last common ancestor had lived tens of millions of years in the past. The predators that hunted in this world of giants were themselves giants, evolved specifically to bring down prey that would seem impossibly large to any modern carnivore. The saber-toothed cat, Smilodon fatalis, remains the most iconic of these killers, its 7-inch canine teeth the stuff of nightmares and museum exhibits alike. About the size of a modern lion, but more powerfully built, with shorter legs and a more muscular frame, Smilodon was an ambush predator that relied on stealth and explosive power rather than pursuit. Those enormous canines were actually surprisingly fragile, designed not for crushing bone, but for delivering precise, devastating wounds to the soft tissues of the throat and belly. Scientists analyzing tooth wear patterns believe these cats specialized in young mammoths and other juvenile megafauna, targeting animals large enough to feed a pride, but not yet powerful enough to fight back effectively. Competing with Smilodon for the title of apex predator was the American lion, an animal that defies easy comparison with its African namesake. Panthera atrox was roughly 25% larger than any lion alive today, a cat that may have weighed over 800 pounds and could have looked a grizzly bear in the eye. Unlike Smilodon with its specialized hunting style, the American lion was probably a more versatile predator, capable of taking a wider range of prey through a combination of ambush and short pursuit. Its bones have been found from Alaska to Mexico, suggesting an animal comfortable in almost any environment the continent could offer. But perhaps no Ice Age predator captures the imagination quite like the dire wolf. These animals have surged into popular culture in recent years, yet the reality of Canis dirus was in many ways stranger than fiction. Despite their name and their superficial resemblance to modern wolves, dire wolves were not closely related to the grey wolves that survive today. Genetic analysis has revealed they belong to an entirely separate lineage that had evolved in the Americas for millions of years. Dire wolves were built for power rather than speed, with massive skulls and bone-crushing teeth that suggest a lifestyle involving as much scavenging as hunting. They gathered in enormous packs, perhaps 30 or more individuals, and their bones dominate the fossil record at sites like the Brea Tar Pits, where more than 4,000 individuals have been recovered. When a mammoth became trapped in the tar, dozens of dire wolves would gather to feed, and one by one, they too would become mired in the deadly seep. Looming over even these impressive predators was the short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, an animal that may have been the most powerful terrestrial carnivore North America has ever known. Standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder when on all fours and capable of rearing up to 11 or 12 feet on its hind legs, the short-faced bear was 30% larger than the largest grizzlies alive today. Its long legs suggest it may have been capable of running down prey over distances, a terrifying thought given its size and power. Some scientists believe it was primarily a scavenger, using its immense bulk to intimidate other predators away from their kills, while others argue it was an active hunter capable of taking down even adult bison. And then there were the ground sloths, creatures so bizarre they would seem like fantasy if their bones weren't scattered across the Americas by the millions. The largest of these, Megatherium americanum, reached the size of a modern elephant, stretching 20 feet from nose to tail and weighing nearly 4 tons. When it reared up on its hind legs, using its massive tail as a third support, it could reach foliage 20 feet above the ground, higher than a giraffe could dream of stretching. Its claws were over a foot long, curved like meat hooks, though they were used not for hunting but for pulling down branches and stripping bark. The giant ground sloth had skin reinforced with thousands of tiny bones called osteoderms, creating a natural chainmail that would have made it nearly invulnerable to any predator. For millions of years, these creatures had no enemies capable of threatening an adult, and they moved through their world with the ponderous confidence of animals that had never learned fear. This, then, was the world that vanished, a world of mammoths rumbling across grasslands, of saber-toothed cats crouching in ambush, of dire wolves howling at twilight, of giant sloths reaching into the treetops. It was an ecosystem of breathtaking complexity and diversity, honed by millions of years of evolution into an intricate web of predator and prey, browser and grazer, giant and giant killer. Understanding what destroyed this world requires us to examine the evidence left behind, preserved in places where time itself seems to have stopped. And there is no better place to begin that examination than in the heart of modern Los Angeles, where bubbling pools of black tar have been trapping and preserving Ice Age life for over 50,000 years. In the heart of one of the world's largest cities, surrounded by art museums and high-rise apartments, lies a crime scene that has been collecting evidence for over 50,000 years. The Brea Tar Pits don't look like much at first glance. A few dark pools bubbling lazily in a manicured park, the sulphurous smell of petroleum hanging in the air, life-sized statues of mammoths posed dramatically as if sinking into the mire. Tourists snap photographs and move on, perhaps not fully grasping that beneath their feet lies the richest deposit of Ice Age fossils anywhere on the planet, a window into the lost world that preserves not just bones but entire ecosystems, frozen at the moment of death. The tar pits formed when crude oil seeped up through the Earth's crust, its lighter components evaporating in the California sun and leaving behind a thick, sticky residue of natural asphalt. This process has been happening for tens of thousands of years, creating pools that look deceptively like water, especially when rainwater collects on their surface. For an animal wandering the Ice Age landscape, these pools would have appeared as nothing more than ordinary ponds, perfect places to drink or cool off on a warm afternoon, but the asphalt was patient and unforgiving. An animal that stepped into one of these pools would find its feet sinking into the tar, the sticky substance gripping tighter with every struggle. The more it fought, the deeper it sank. A large herbivore trapped in this way, a mammoth perhaps, or a bison or an ancient camel, would bellow in distress as the tar crept up its legs, its cries carrying across the grasslands to every predator within earshot. And this is where the tar pits became something extraordinary, a mechanism that scientists call the carnivore trap. That single trapped herbivore would attract predators from miles around, dire wolves and saber-toothed cats drawn by the promise of an easy meal. One by one, they would approach the struggling animal, and one by one, they too would become mired in the asphalt. A single dying mammoth might draw dozens of predators to their deaths over the days or weeks it took the great animal to finally succumb. The result is a fossil record unlike anything else on Earth, one where carnivores dramatically outnumber the herbivores they fed upon, preserved together in a tableau of ancient tragedy. The numbers are staggering. More than 4,000 dire wolves have been recovered from Brea, their skulls forming an entire wall at the museum that now stands beside the pits. Over 2,000 saber-toothed cats lie in the collection, along with hundreds of American lions, short-faced bears, and coyotes. The herbivores are there too, mammoths and mastodons, ancient bison and horses, camels and ground sloths, but they are vastly outnumbered by the predators and scavengers that came to feast on them. In total, the collection exceeds 3.5 million specimens, representing over 600 different species of animals and plants, from the massive skeletons that draw visitors to the delicate bones of songbirds and the tiny shells of snails. What makes Brea invaluable to scientists investigating the megafauna extinction is the quality of preservation and the precision with which the fossils can be dated. The asphalt that killed these animals also protected their bones from decay, keeping them virtually unchanged for tens of thousands of years. Unlike fossils from other sites that have been mineralized and transformed, the bones from Brea are still original bone, their proteins intact enough to allow sophisticated chemical analyses that would be impossible elsewhere. Scientists can determine not just when an animal died, but what it ate, how much water it drank, and even what the climate was like during its lifetime. The dating of these fossils has transformed our understanding of when exactly the megafauna disappeared from Southern California. For decades, scientists assumed the extinctions coincided with the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden climate cooling that began around 12,900 years ago. The thinking was straightforward enough. The climate changed dramatically. The animals couldn't adapt, and they died. It was a tidy explanation that fit the narrative of climate-driven extinction. But in 2023, a team of researchers published findings that upended this comfortable assumption. By carefully radiocarbon dating 169 fossils from 7 different species – dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, American lions, ancient bison, horses, camels, and ground sloths – they discovered something remarkable. All of the Megafauna species had vanished from the Brea record by 12,900 years ago, right at the very beginning of the Younger Dryas. They hadn't died during the cold snap. They had disappeared before it even started. The implications were profound. If climate change had killed these animals, you would expect to find their bones scattered throughout the Younger Dryas period, perhaps declining gradually as conditions worsened. Instead, the fossil record showed an abrupt cut-off, as if someone had drawn a line in time and erased everything above it. The only exception was the coyote, whose fossils continued to appear in the tar pits for thousands of years after their larger relatives had vanished. Whatever killed the megafauna, the coyotes had somehow survived it. The researchers then turned to other evidence preserved in the region, examining sediment cores from nearby Lake Elsinore that recorded ancient pollen and charcoal. What they found was a story of fire. Beginning around 13,500 years ago, charcoal levels in the lake sediments began to rise. By 13,200 years ago, they had spiked to levels unprecedented in the previous 50,000 years of record. Massive wildfires were sweeping across Southern California, transforming the landscape from woodland to the fire-adapted chaparral that exists there today. The timing of this fire regime coincided almost exactly with the disappearance of the megafauna from Brea. As the fires increased, the large mammals vanished. The researchers proposed that they were witnessing an ecological state shift, a fundamental reorganization of the ecosystem driven by fire, climate warming, and, they suspected, human activity. The charcoal spike corresponded with a period of increasing human population in the region, suggesting that people may have been setting fires that pushed an already stressed ecosystem past its breaking point. Only one human has ever been found at Brea, a young woman who died between 10,000 and 9,000 years ago. Known simply as Brea woman, she was between 17 and 25 years old at her death and was found in association with a domestic dog, suggesting she had been ceremonially buried rather than accidentally trapped. Her presence reminds us that humans were here, living alongside the last of the megafauna, witnesses to an extinction that would reshape the continent. The tar pits continue to collect their grim harvest even today. Birds land on the pools, mistake them for water, and become trapped. Insects, rodents, and the occasional unlucky pigeon join the fossil record each year, a reminder that the processes that created this extraordinary site are still operating. Scientists continue to excavate, most recently working through massive deposits discovered during construction of a parking garage in 2006. Project 23, as it is called, has yielded thousands of new specimens, including remarkably complete skeletons that are rewriting what we know about these animals. But Brea, for all its riches, represents only one location at one moment in time. The story it tells is specific to Southern California, to a particular ecosystem undergoing a particular transformation. To understand the full scope of the extinction, scientists needed to consider explanations that could account for the loss of megafauna across entire continents, from the Arctic tundra to the tropical forests of South America. And for over half a century, two competing explanations have dominated the debate, each with passionate defenders and troubling weaknesses. The first points to the dramatic climate changes that marked the end of the Ice Age. The second points to a newcomer on the landscape, a two-legged predator armed with stone-tipped spears and an intelligence no prey animal had ever encountered before. To understand why scientists first looked to climate change as the explanation for the megafauna extinction, you need to appreciate just how dramatically the world was transforming at the end of the Pleistocene. For over 2 million years, the Earth had been locked in a cycle of glacial and interglacial periods, massive ice sheets advancing and retreating across the northern continents in a rhythm that reshaped landscapes and redirected ocean currents. The animals that lived through this time had become, in a sense, specialists in surviving change itself, adapting to temperature swings that would seem catastrophic by any modern standard. But the warming that began around 15,000 years ago was different in both speed and scope. Global mean temperatures rose by roughly 6 degrees Celsius over just 5,000 years, a rate of change that sounds modest until you consider what it meant on the ground. Ice sheets that had been miles thick began to collapse, releasing torrents of meltwater that carved new river valleys and drowned coastal plains. Sea levels rose by more than 300 feet, transforming the geography of every continent. The Mammoth steppe, that vast grassland ecosystem that had stretched from Spain to the Great Lakes, began to fragment and disappear, replaced by boreal forests in the north and expanding deserts in warmer regions. For animals that had evolved specifically to thrive in cold, open environments, this transformation would have been catastrophic. The woolly mammoth, with its thick coat and layers of insulating fat, was built for a world of sub-zero temperatures and endless grasslands. As forests spread and temperatures rose, their habitat quite literally vanished beneath them. The long-growing season grasses they depended on were replaced by woody shrubs and trees that their flat, ridged teeth couldn't efficiently process. A mammoth trying to survive in a boreal forest would be like a polar bear trying to make a living in a tropical jungle. The basic requirements for life would be missing. The timing seemed to support this climate explanation perfectly. The main pulse of extinctions in North America occurred between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, precisely coinciding with one of the most dramatic climate events of the entire deglaciation period. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, and it represents one of the most abrupt and mysterious climate shifts preserved in the geological record. The Younger Dryas began 12,900 years ago, when temperatures across the northern hemisphere suddenly plummeted. In Greenland, ice core records show temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, and the cooling happened with shocking speed. The transition from warm to cold took place in just 3 years. North America saw temperatures fall by roughly 3 degrees Celsius, while Europe experienced drops of between 2 and 6 degrees. This wasn't a gradual slide into colder conditions. It was more like someone had flipped a switch, plunging the world back into near glacial cold in the space of a human generation. The event takes its name from Dryas octopetala, a small alpine wildflower whose pollen appears suddenly in sediment cores from this period, marking the return of tundra conditions to regions that had been warming and greening just decades before. For 1,200 years, this cold snap persisted, and then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it ended. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures shot back up, this time permanently. The Ice Age was truly over, and the modern warm period we call the Holocene had begun. The mechanism that triggered the Younger Dryas remains a subject of scientific debate, but the most widely accepted explanation involves the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great conveyor belt of ocean currents that carries warm water north and cold water south. As the North American ice sheet melted, it released enormous volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This meltwater, less dense than salt water, may have disrupted the normal sinking of cold, salty water that drives the circulation. When the circulation weakened or shut down, it stopped delivering warm water to the North Atlantic region, and temperatures plummeted across the northern continents. For scientists investigating megafauna extinctions in the 1960s and 1970s, this seemed like the perfect explanation. Here was a period of intense climate instability occurring at exactly the right time, with temperatures swinging wildly between extremes. Animals that had adapted to relatively stable glacial conditions would have found themselves in a world where the rules kept changing, first warming, then suddenly cooling, then warming again, all within a few thousand years. The stress of adapting to such rapid changes, combined with shrinking and fragmenting habitats, could easily have pushed many species to extinction. Evidence from ancient pollen records seemed to support this interpretation. Researchers examining sediment cores from sites across North America found dramatic shifts in vegetation during the terminal Pleistocene. In Texas, ancient pack rat middens preserved plant remains showing the transformation from mixed woodland parkland to grassland prairie. In the northeast, spruce-dominated forests gave way to deciduous woodlands as temperatures rose. The mammoth steppe itself was disappearing, breaking up into smaller and smaller fragments as forests encroached from all directions. A study conducted at Hall's Cave in Texas, using ancient DNA extracted from sediments, provided particularly compelling evidence for the complexity of ecosystem change during this period. Researchers recovered DNA from 100 vertebrate species and 45 plant taxa, creating a detailed picture of how the community had changed over thousands of years. What they found was striking. During the Younger Dryas cold period, plant diversity in the region dropped significantly as certain species disappeared or became rare. But when the climate warmed again and the Younger Dryas ended, plant diversity recovered. The plants came back. The animals, however, did not. Animal diversity dropped during the same period that plant diversity declined, but unlike the plants, it never recovered after the climate improved. The megafauna that had disappeared during the cold snap remained gone even when conditions returned to favor their survival. This pattern suggested something more complicated than simple climate forcing, some additional factor that affected animals but not plants, that persisted even after the climate crisis had passed. And therein lay the fundamental problem with the climate-only hypothesis. These animals, or their ancestors, had survived approximately 25 similar climate swings over the previous 120,000 years. The Younger Dryas wasn't even the most dramatic of these events. Scientists studying Greenland ice cores have identified what they call Dansgaard-Oeschger events, rapid climate oscillations that occurred roughly every 1,500 years during the last glacial period. Some of these involved temperature changes as large or larger than the Younger Dryas, occurring with similar rapidity. Yet none of them had triggered a mass extinction of megafauna. Why would the final deglaciation be different? If climate change alone was sufficient to cause extinction, wouldn't we expect to see similar die-offs associated with previous glacial-interglacial transitions? The geological record suggests that megafauna populations waxed and waned in response to climate shifts, expanding during favorable periods and contracting during harsh ones, but they didn't go extinct. Mammoths had survived multiple complete glacial cycles. Saber-toothed cats had weathered dozens of climate oscillations. Giant ground sloths had trudged through cold periods and warm periods for millions of years. Something about this final warming period was different, and climate change alone couldn't explain what that difference was. The extinction was too selective, too size-biased. Small mammals came through the terminal Pleistocene largely unscathed. Mice and voles, rabbits and squirrels all survived the supposedly catastrophic climate shifts without major losses. If climate change was the killer, why did it target only the large animals? And then there was the geographical pattern. Africa, with its megafauna that included elephants and rhinoceroses every bit as large as mammoths and ground sloths, lost only about 21% of its large mammal genera. Asia lost about 35%. But North America lost 72%, South America lost 83%, and Australia lost a staggering 88%. All of these continents experienced end Pleistocene climate change, yet the severity of extinctions varied dramatically between them. Climate was clearly global. The extinctions were not equally so. This geographic pattern pointed toward a different kind of explanation, one that could account for extinctions occurring at different times on different continents, one that could explain why large animals were preferentially affected, and one that could clarify why this deglaciation was different from all the ones that had come before. That explanation centered not on changing temperatures or transforming habitats, but on the spread of a new predator across the globe, one that hadn't existed during previous interglacials, one whose impact on megafauna would prove far more devastating than any climate shift. The evidence for this alternative explanation had been building since the early days of American paleontology, but it took a controversial scientist named Paul Martin to transform scattered observations into a comprehensive theory that would dominate extinction debates for the next half-century. His hypothesis was provocative, troubling, and for many scientists, uncomfortably persuasive. He called it overkill. Paul Schultz Martin was not a man given to subtle arguments or diplomatic compromises. Born in 1928, he spent much of his career at the University of Arizona, studying pollen records and ancient climates, building a reputation as a careful scientist who understood the complexities of past environments better than most. But in 1967, he published a paper that would make him one of the most controversial figures in paleontology, a scientist whose name would become synonymous with a theory that divided researchers into passionate camps and sparked debates that continue to this day. Martin's hypothesis was simple, provocative, and devastating in its implications. The Ice Age megafauna, he argued, had not been killed by climate change at all. They had been slaughtered by human hunters, exterminated in a wave of overkill that swept across continents with the speed and efficiency of a military campaign. He called this the Blitzkrieg model, invoking the German term for lightning war, and he meant it literally. Within 1,000 years of human arrival in any given region, he claimed, the megafauna would be gone, hunted to extinction by a predator unlike any the world had ever seen. The evidence Martin assembled was circumstantial but compelling, a pattern of correlations that became harder to dismiss the more closely you examined them. The timing was the first and most striking piece of evidence. Everywhere humans went, extinctions followed. In Australia, megafauna began disappearing between 46,000 and 43,000 years ago, within just a few thousand years of the earliest confirmed human presence on the continent. In North America, the main extinction pulse occurred between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, shortly after humans had spread throughout the continent from their initial arrival points on the Pacific coast. In South America, the extinctions came later still, tracking the southward expansion of human populations through the Americas. This pattern held across oceanic islands as well. Madagascar lost its giant lemurs, elephant birds, and pygmy hippos within a few centuries of human arrival around 2,000 years ago. New Zealand's moas, flightless birds that had evolved in the absence of mammalian predators, vanished within 200 years of Polynesian settlement in the 13th century. The Caribbean islands lost their ground sloths roughly 6,000 years ago, thousands of years after their mainland relatives had disappeared, but almost immediately after humans reached the islands. Every time humans arrived somewhere new, it seemed, the largest animals quickly disappeared. The geographic pattern that had troubled the climate hypothesis actually strengthened Martin's case. Africa, where humans had evolved and lived for millions of years, retained most of its megafauna. The animals there had co-evolved with increasingly sophisticated human hunters, developing over countless generations the wariness and behavioral adaptations necessary to avoid becoming prey. An African elephant that sees humans approaching knows instinctively to be cautious, to keep its distance, to associate the sight and smell of people with danger. This knowledge is baked into its evolutionary history, refined by millions of years of natural selection. But the megafauna of the Americas, Australia, and remote islands had never encountered humans before. They were what Martin called naive prey, animals with no evolutionary experience of human predation, no instinct to flee from a two-legged hunter, no understanding that this strange creature with a wooden spear was the most dangerous thing they would ever face. A mammoth that had never seen a human would have no reason to run. A giant ground sloth would see these small, upright apes as nothing more than curious oddities, certainly not as threats to an animal armored with bone-studded skin and claws like scythes. The archaeological evidence, though limited, seemed to support the idea that humans were indeed hunting megafauna. The Clovis culture, which appeared in North America around 13,000 years ago, left behind distinctive stone points that are among the most beautiful weapons ever crafted. These points were large and symmetrical, flaked with extraordinary skill from high-quality stone that people sometimes transported hundreds of miles to obtain. And they have been found in association with mammoth and mastodon remains at sites scattered across the continent. The Clovis sites are not numerous. Only about 15 have been securely documented as definitive kill sites where humans clearly butchered large animals. But they exist, and they prove beyond doubt that humans did hunt mammoths and mastodons. At the Colby site in Wyoming, researchers found the remains of multiple mammoths along with piles of bones that had been stacked as if cached for later use, suggesting a level of planning and cooperation in the hunt. At the Murray Springs site in Arizona, a mammoth skeleton showed clear evidence of butchery, the bones arranged in patterns that could only result from human activity. Martin argued that the scarcity of kill sites was actually evidence supporting his hypothesis, not weakening it. A true blitzkrieg, he suggested, would happen too quickly to leave much archaeological trace. If human populations expanded rapidly through virgin territory filled with naive prey, they could drive species to extinction within a few centuries, long before accumulating the kind of dense archaeological record that would be easy to find tens of thousands of years later. You wouldn't need to kill every single animal, just enough to drive populations below viable thresholds, especially if you focused on females and young animals whose loss would prevent population recovery. The size bias of the extinctions also made sense in this context. Human hunters would naturally target the largest animals, which provided the most meat for the effort invested. A mammoth or a giant ground sloth represented enough food to feed a group for weeks or even months. Smaller animals like deer or rabbits, while certainly hunted, were less attractive targets for people armed with weapons that required close approach and significant risk. Climate change, in contrast, should affect all animals roughly equally, or at least not preferentially target the largest species. Martin's most controversial claim was about the speed of extinction. He calculated that a human population growing at just 1.4% per year, a conservative rate for a pioneering population in a resource-rich environment, could expand from the Bering Strait to the tip of South America in less than 1,000 years. As this wave of humanity swept south, it would encounter megafauna populations that had never learned to fear humans. The extinction front would move ahead of the human population, he argued, as overhunting decimated prey populations faster than they could reproduce. This aspect of the theory proved particularly troubling to some researchers and indigenous communities. The overkill hypothesis, critics pointed out, painted early humans as reckless destroyers of nature. wasteful hunters who drove entire species to extinction without regard for sustainability. Vine Deloria Jr., a Native American author and activist, called the theory an attempt to blame indigenous peoples for environmental destruction, a way of portraying them as inherently destructive rather than as careful stewards of the land, as many indigenous traditions maintained. But Martin was adamant that his theory carried no moral judgment. Extinction, he argued, was not the result of callousness or wastefulness, but simply of encountering prey that didn't know to run. Any human population faced with easily killed animals would naturally exploit that resource, just as any predator does. The tragedy wasn't that humans were evil, but that the animals hadn't evolved defenses against them. In Africa, where such defenses had evolved over millions of years, both humans and megafauna had survived. In the Americas, where megafauna encountered humans for the first time, the animals simply didn't have the evolutionary toolkit to survive. The overkill hypothesis gained significant support from a major study published in 2015 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Researchers compiled radiocarbon dates from 51 megafauna genera across North and South America, creating the most comprehensive timeline of extinctions ever assembled. What they found was a clear north to south pattern, with extinctions occurring progressively later as you moved south through the continents. This transgressive wave of extinctions matched almost perfectly with what you would expect from human populations expanding from north to south, encountering and eliminating naive prey populations as they went. More recently, a 2023 study published in Nature Communications analyzed genetic data from 139 living megafauna species, reconstructing population histories over the past 50,000 years. The researchers found that 91% of these species had experienced significant population declines over this period, with the timing and severity of declines better explained by human expansion than by climate change. The study concluded that human impact became the main driver of megafauna dynamics around 75,000 years ago, long before the end Pleistocene extinctions, suggesting that humans had been affecting megafauna populations from the very beginning of our species' global expansion. For Martin and his supporters, this pattern of evidence was overwhelming. The timing correlations, the geographic patterns, the size bias, the naive prey concept, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Humans had killed the Ice Age giants, not through any single massive hunt, but through the cumulative effect of thousands of hunts across thousands of years, a slow erosion of populations that lacked the evolutionary experience to survive our arrival. But not everyone was convinced. As Martin's overkill hypothesis gained prominence, a growing chorus of critics began pointing out serious problems with the theory, weaknesses that Martin's passionate advocacy couldn't entirely answer. The kill sites, they noted, told a troubling story, or rather, they told almost no story at all. Donald Grayson and David Meltzer were not given to inflammatory language in their scientific papers, but in 2001 they published a critique of the overkill hypothesis that used words rarely seen in academic journals. They called Martin's theory a faith-based credo, arguing that it persisted not because of strong evidence, but because researchers wanted to believe it. Their assessment was harsh, deliberate, and backed by a systematic review of every claimed Clovis kill site in North America. What they found was troubling for anyone convinced that human hunters had wiped out the continent's megafauna. The numbers told a stark story. After examining decades of archaeological literature and visiting many sites personally, Grayson and Meltzer identified only 15 locations where humans had definitively killed and butchered Ice Age megafauna. 15 sites spread across an entire continent, representing perhaps a few dozen individual animals at most. And of those 15 sites, 14 involved just two species, mammoths and mastodons. The 15th site contained the remains of a single horse. That was it. That was the entire archaeological record of confirmed Clovis hunting of large mammals. But 33 genera of megafauna had gone extinct in North America. Where was the evidence that humans had hunted any of the others? Where were the kill sites for the giant ground sloths that had lumbered through forests from Alaska to Mexico? Where were the butchered remains of camels, of horses beyond that single specimen, of saber-toothed cats or American lions or dire wolves? Where were the ancient bison that should have been easy prey for human hunters? Not a single confirmed kill site existed for any of these animals. The pattern was even more perplexing when you considered what actually appeared at Clovis archaeological sites. Roughly 80% of Clovis sites that contained animal bones included remains of proboscideans, mammoths or mastodons. This might seem to support the overkill hypothesis, except that these animals represented only 2 of the 33 extinct genera. If humans were hunting everything to extinction, you would expect to find bones from all sorts of animals at these sites, a diverse assemblage representing opportunistic hunting of whatever was available. Instead, the archaeological record suggested an almost exclusive focus on 2 types of prey. Grayson and Meltzer proposed a simpler explanation. Clovis people did hunt mammoths and mastodons, probably opportunistically when circumstances allowed. But these hunts were rare and dangerous, hardly the kind of systematic slaughter that could drive species to extinction. Most of the time, Clovis hunters probably pursued smaller, less dangerous prey that were easier to kill and processed: deer, rabbits, birds. The absence of kill sites for most extinct genera wasn't just a problem of preservation or archaeological visibility. It was evidence that these animals simply weren't being hunted in significant numbers. The critics also pointed to a fundamental problem with the Blitzkrieg model's timeline. For decades, the narrative had been straightforward. Humans arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago with the Clovis culture, and the extinctions followed within a few centuries. But archaeological discoveries in South America had complicated this story considerably. The Monteverde site in Chile, dated to at least 14,500 years ago, proved conclusively that humans had been in the Americas long before Clovis. Other sites suggested even earlier arrivals, pushing human presence back to 16,000 or possibly 17,000 years ago. This earlier arrival date meant that humans and megafauna had coexisted for 2,000 to 3,000 years before the main extinction pulse occurred. 2,000 to 3,000 years is a long time, long enough for dozens of human generations, long enough for animals to learn to avoid hunters, long enough that the naive prey concept becomes problematic. If megafauna survived for millennia after human arrival, why did they suddenly collapse all at once between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago? What changed? The problem became even more acute when you looked at individual species ranges. Mammoths, for instance, survived in various refugia long after the main extinction event. On St. Paul Island in Alaska, they persisted until 5,600 years ago. On Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia, they survived until about 4,000 years ago, existing into the age of Egyptian pyramids and Bronze Age civilizations. These isolated populations weren't hidden from humans. Archaeological evidence confirms human presence in the regions at the same time. Yet the mammoths survived for thousands of years, suggesting that human hunting pressure alone wasn't necessarily fatal to their persistence. Another challenge to the overkill hypothesis came from optimal foraging theory, a framework that predicts how hunters should allocate their time and energy. Mammoths were enormous animals, certainly, but they were also incredibly dangerous prey. A full-grown mammoth could weigh 6 to 8 tons and stood taller than any human with a spear. Its tusks were formidable weapons, and it could crush a person with casual ease. Mastodons, though browsers rather than grazers, were equally massive and equally dangerous when threatened. Hunters following optimal foraging principles should generally avoid the most dangerous prey unless easier options are scarce. In a landscape teeming with horses, bison, camels, deer, and smaller game, why would Clovis hunters routinely risk their lives attacking mammoths? The energy return might be high if you succeeded, but the risk of injury or death was substantial, and a failed hunt meant wasted effort and potential loss of valuable weapons. Some researchers calculated that mammoth hunting might actually have been energetically disadvantageous once you factored in the injury risk and the probability of hunt failure. The geographic pattern of extinctions also troubled the overkill critics. If human hunting was the primary driver, you would expect extinctions to track very closely with human population expansion, with clear evidence of human presence preceding or coinciding with megafauna disappearance. But in many regions, the correlation was fuzzy at best. Some areas showed extinctions before clear archaeological evidence of substantial human populations. Others showed humans and megafauna coexisting for extended periods without obvious signs of population stress in the animal communities. Perhaps most fundamentally, critics argued that the overkill hypothesis couldn't explain why this deglaciation was different from all the previous ones. Humans had existed in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years and in Eurasia for at least 60,000 years. During that time, multiple glacial-interglacial cycles had occurred, each involving massive climate changes and ecological reorganizations. Yet no mass extinction of megafauna had occurred during any of these earlier transitions. Why would human hunting suddenly become catastrophic to megafauna populations at the end of the Pleistocene when it hadn't been before? Some researchers suggested that the answer lay not in hunting technology, which hadn't changed dramatically, but in human population density. Perhaps earlier human populations had been too sparse to exert significant pressure on megafauna, and it was only when human numbers reached critical thresholds that hunting became unsustainable for prey populations. But this raised its own questions. What caused human populations to grow? Why at this particular moment in time? And if climate change was driving human population growth, wasn't climate still playing a crucial role in the extinction process? The more scientists examined the overkill hypothesis, the more problems they found. It explained some patterns beautifully: the correlation between human arrival and extinction timing on islands, the survival of African megafauna, the size bias of extinctions. But it stumbled on others: the scarcity of kill sites, the long coexistence period, the energetics of mammoth hunting, the absence of previous extinction pulses. The hypothesis that had seemed so elegantly simple in Martin's 1967 formulation turned out to be far more complicated when you examined the details. Yet even as critics dismantled the pure overkill hypothesis, they couldn't entirely dismiss human impact. The correlations were too strong, the patterns too consistent across continents. Perhaps some researchers began to suggest the answer wasn't choosing between climate and humans as the sole cause. Perhaps both played roles, their effects interacting and amplifying each other in ways that neither factor alone could have achieved. Perhaps what killed the Ice Age giants wasn't a single bullet, but a combination of wounds, each factor making the animals more vulnerable to the others. And nowhere was this possibility more dramatically illustrated than in the fossil record of Southern California, where scientists were beginning to uncover evidence of a third factor, one that could tie together climate change, human activity, and ecosystem collapse into a single, devastating chain of events. That factor was fire, and its signature was written in charcoal layers thick enough to suggest that the landscape itself had gone up in flames. The year 2023 brought a study that would fundamentally reshape how scientists understood the megafauna extinction in North America. A team led by researchers from the Brea Tar Pits Museum published their findings in the journal Science, and what they revealed was a story far more complex than either the climate or overkill hypotheses alone could explain. They had discovered evidence of an ecosystem collapse driven not by a single cause, but by the convergence of multiple factors at exactly the wrong moment in time, a perfect storm where climate, humans, and fire combined to push an already stressed system past its breaking point. The researchers had taken a methodical approach, radiocarbon dating 169 fossils from 7 different megafauna species recovered from the tar pits. If you examined these dates closely, you would see a detailed timeline of when each species disappeared from the Brea record. What emerged was striking in its clarity. All of the megafauna, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, American lions, ancient bison, horses, camels, and ground sloths, had vanished by 12,900 years ago, right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas cold period. They hadn't died during the climate disruption. They had disappeared just before it started. But the extinction wasn't the only story preserved in the geological record. The team also examined sediment cores from Lake Elsinore, located about 80 miles southeast of Los Angeles, which contained a continuous record of pollen, charcoal, and other environmental indicators stretching back tens of thousands of years. The charcoal in these cores told a dramatic tale of landscape transformation, one that had occurred in lockstep with the megafauna disappearance. Beginning around 13,500 years ago, charcoal levels in the lake sediments started to rise. This increase accelerated rapidly over the next few centuries, reaching a peak between 13,200 and 12,900 years ago. During this period, the amount of charcoal being deposited in the lake reached levels unprecedented in the previous 50,000 years of record. Something had fundamentally changed about fire on the landscape, transforming what had been relatively infrequent natural burns into a regime of massive, recurring wildfires. The timing of this fire regime aligned almost perfectly with 2 other changes occurring simultaneously. First, the climate was warming and drying, making vegetation more flammable and fire seasons longer. Southern California was shifting from a landscape dominated by oak woodlands and chaparral to one increasingly dominated by fire-adapted shrublands. The longer growing seasons and reduced winter rainfall meant that by late summer, the landscape was tinder dry, ready to burn at the slightest spark. Second, human populations in the region were growing. Archaeological evidence showed an increase in human activity during precisely the period when fires were becoming more frequent and more intense. The researchers proposed that humans, either through deliberate landscape burning or through accidental fires, were igniting the dried vegetation far more frequently than lightning strikes alone ever would. Each fire would have triggered feedback loops. Burning removed trees and created open spaces where grasses and shrubs grew, which were themselves more flammable than the forests they replaced, which led to more frequent fires, which created still more open habitat. This wasn't just a case of more fires burning more land. The fires were fundamentally reorganizing the ecosystem, creating what ecologists call a state shift, a transformation so profound that the system couldn't return to its previous condition even if the factors that triggered the change were removed. The woodland parkland landscape that had characterized Southern California for thousands of years was being replaced by the chaparral ecosystem that exists there today, a plant community specifically adapted to frequent fires. For the megafauna, this transformation would have been catastrophic. If you were a mammoth watching your woodland home burn year after year, you would find yourself in a landscape increasingly unable to support your needs. Large herbivores like mammoths, mastodons, and ground sloths required enormous amounts of vegetation to sustain themselves. An adult mammoth needed to consume over 300 pounds of plant matter every single day. As fires repeatedly swept across the landscape, They removed the woody vegetation these animals depended on, replacing it with shrubs and grasses that either grew back slowly or weren't suitable forage. Even if the animals themselves escaped the flames, they would find themselves in a world where their next meal was increasingly difficult to find. The carnivores faced their own crisis. Saber-toothed cats, American lions, and dire wolves had evolved to hunt mega-herbivores. Their bodies and hunting strategies specialized for bringing down large prey. As the herbivore populations declined, the predator populations would inevitably follow. The carnivore trap effect at La Brea actually documented this cascade. As herbivores became scarcer, fewer became trapped in the tar, which meant fewer predators were attracted to the site, which meant fewer predator fossils were preserved. The sudden disappearance of all megafauna from the La Brea record around 12,900 years ago suggests that populations had crashed below viable levels, falling to numbers so low that animals simply stopped encountering the tar pits by chance. What made this scenario particularly compelling was that it could explain patterns that neither climate nor overkill alone could account for. The size bias made sense. Larger animals required more food and were more vulnerable to habitat fragmentation. A mammoth needed a continuous landscape of suitable vegetation. A deer could survive in fragmented patches. The lack of kill sites for most species also made sense. Humans didn't need to hunt everything to extinction. By altering the fire regime, they could indirectly destroy the habitat that these animals required, causing population collapses without ever bringing down a single animal with a spear. The geographic variation in extinction severity across continents also fit this model. Africa, where humans and megafauna had co-evolved for millions of years, had fire regimes that both humans and animals had adapted to over deep time. The landscape had reached an equilibrium where controlled burning by humans was part of the ecosystem, and animals had behavioral adaptations to survive fire. But in the Americas, neither the megafauna nor the plant communities had evolutionary experience with human-modified fire regimes. When people began burning the landscape, neither plants nor animals knew how to respond. Australia provided perhaps the clearest example of this pattern. There, megafauna extinctions occurred around 46,000 to 43,000 years ago, well before the end of the Pleistocene and during a period of relatively stable climate. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that indigenous Australians used landscape burning extensively, transforming vegetation communities across the continent. The extinctions there couldn't be blamed on dramatic climate change because the climate wasn't changing dramatically, but they coincided almost exactly with the arrival of humans and the transformation of fire regimes. The concept that emerged from these studies was one of synergistic effects, where multiple factors combined to create an impact greater than the sum of their parts. Climate warming alone might not have killed the megafauna. They had survived previous warmings. Human hunting alone might not have driven extinctions. The kill site evidence was too sparse, the coexistence period too long. Fire alone might have been manageable. Many animals can survive individual burns. But climate warming that created dry, flammable conditions, plus human presence that increased ignition sources and altered fire frequency, plus the resulting habitat transformation, plus targeted hunting of stressed populations. This combination created a cascade that populations couldn't survive. If you've ever been caught in rough ocean waves, you know the difference between riding out a single swell and being tumbled by multiple waves hitting from different directions. A single wave, no matter how large, can be managed if you see it coming and time your response. But when waves converge from multiple directions, each amplifying the others, even the strongest swimmer can be overwhelmed. The megafauna of the late Pleistocene found themselves caught in exactly such a convergence, assaulted simultaneously by changing climate, fragmenting habitat, altered fire regimes, and a novel predator. Each factor made them more vulnerable to the others, creating a positive feedback loop that drove populations downward until recovery became impossible. This understanding represented a fundamental shift in how scientists approached the extinction question. The debate was no longer about choosing between climate and humans as the sole cause. It was about understanding how these factors interacted, how their timing and intensity combined to push ecosystems past critical thresholds, and why some species and some regions were more vulnerable than others to this perfect storm of changes. Yet even as this more nuanced picture emerged for North America, scientists recognized that the story couldn't be exactly the same everywhere. If you compared the extinction patterns across continents, you would see dramatic differences, different timing, different ecological contexts, different outcomes. To truly understand what killed the Ice Age giants, researchers needed to examine places where the variables were different, where one or another factor was amplified or reduced. And there was no better natural experiment for testing these hypotheses than the continent where megafauna extinctions had occurred in dramatically different circumstances, Africa, where the giants had somehow survived when their cousins on every other continent had perished. When scientists first began mapping global patterns of megafauna extinction, Africa presented a puzzle that demanded explanation. While North America had lost 72% of its large mammal genera, South America 83%, and Australia a staggering 88%, Africa, the continent with some of the largest land animals on Earth, had lost only about 21%. Elephants still thundered across savannas, rhinoceroses still wallowed in waterholes, hippopotamuses still claimed rivers and lakes, giraffes still browsed acacia trees, lions still hunted in coordinated prides. The megafauna that had vanished everywhere else had somehow survived in Africa, and understanding why became crucial to understanding the extinction itself. The most compelling explanation emerged from considering Africa's unique position in human evolutionary history. This was where our species was born, where the genus Homo had evolved and diversified over millions of years. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, but our hominin ancestors had been present on the continent for over 7 million years. Even before modern humans appeared, earlier species like Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis were hunting with increasingly sophisticated tools and strategies. This deep history meant that African megafauna had been exposed to human predation for an immense span of time, while the mammoths of North America encountered humans as a completely novel threat around 16,000 years ago, and while Australian megafauna met people for the first time perhaps 65,000 years ago, African elephants had been dealing with various human species for hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. If you were an African animal, humans weren't a shocking new predator that appeared without warning. They were an established part of the ecosystem, a threat that your ancestors had faced generation after generation, selecting for behaviors and instincts that promoted survival. This process, which scientists call coevolution, created what amounts to an evolutionary arms race between predator and prey. As early humans became better hunters, developing more effective weapons, more sophisticated cooperative strategies, better understanding of animal behavior, the prey species were simultaneously evolving better defenses. Animals that were too trusting of humans didn't survive to pass on their genes. Animals that maintained distance, that associated human sight and scent with danger, that altered their behavior when people were nearby. These were the ones whose lineages persisted. The result was a state of what researchers call trophic equilibrium, a balance between predator and prey, where neither side holds an overwhelming advantage. African elephants today demonstrate this balance perfectly. If you approach a wild elephant in its natural habitat, it knows exactly what you are. It will watch you carefully, assess whether you pose a threat, and respond appropriately. sometimes fleeing, sometimes displaying aggression, always maintaining a level of wariness that reflects millions of years of evolutionary experience with human hunters. Even animals in protected areas, where they haven't been hunted for decades, retain this instinctual caution. Compare this to the behavior of island species that evolved without predators, animals that biologists call naive. The dodo of Mauritius walked up to sailors with curiosity rather than fear. The moas of New Zealand, which had evolved in the absence of mammalian predators, had no flight response when Polynesian settlers arrived. The Steller's sea cow, discovered in the Bering Sea in 1741, was described as being so tame it could be approached and touched before being killed. These animals weren't stupid. They simply lacked the evolutionary programming to recognize humans as threats because their ancestors had never needed such programming to survive. The megafauna of North America, Australia, and South America likely exhibited similar naivety when humans first arrived. A mammoth that had never seen a human would have no more reason to fear one than a modern elephant has to fear a rabbit. The animal would probably investigate out of curiosity, perhaps treat humans as it might any other small creature, perhaps ignore them entirely. This naivety would have made them extraordinarily vulnerable during the critical first few thousand years of contact, the period when Martin's Overkill blitzkrieg would have been most effective. But the story of African megafauna survival isn't quite as simple as coevolution alone. When scientists examined the deeper history of African megafauna, they discovered something intriguing. The continent had actually been losing large mammals for much longer than the late Pleistocene extinctions that devastated other continents. Starting around 4 million years ago, Africa began experiencing a gradual decline in megafauna diversity, losing species at a slow but steady rate over millions of years. This longer timeline suggested that multiple factors beyond human hunting had been shaping African megafauna communities for ages. Climate change, particularly the expansion of grasslands at the expense of forests, had been transforming African habitats for millions of years. As forests shrank and savannas expanded, animals adapted to forest life declined, while grassland specialists thrived. Some of this decline coincided with the evolution and spread of various hominin species, but much of it preceded the appearance of sophisticated hunters. The African pattern revealed something crucial about the global extinction puzzle. It wasn't that Africa had avoided extinction entirely. It had experienced significant losses over deep time, but those losses had occurred gradually, spread across millions of years, allowing ecosystems and animal populations time to adapt. The explosive, near-instantaneous extinctions that characterized other continents simply hadn't happened in Africa. Whatever factors were driving African megafauna decline, they operated slowly enough that adaptation was possible. This suggested a critical threshold concept. Megafauna populations could apparently withstand gradual changes, whether from climate shifts, habitat transformation, or sustainable hunting pressure, as long as those changes happened slowly enough for behavioral and evolutionary adaptation to occur. What they couldn't survive was the sudden convergence of multiple novel stressors happening faster than adaptation could proceed. In Africa, humans and megafauna had co-evolved over timescales measured in millions of years. In the Americas and Australia, megafauna encountered modern humans as a completely novel threat against a backdrop of rapid climate change and habitat transformation, all within timescales measured in thousands of years. The comparison becomes even more striking when you consider specific examples. African elephants and Asian elephants are closely related species with similar ecological requirements. Both survived the Pleistocene, both still exist today, though Asian elephants are now critically endangered. But their North American relatives, the Columbian mammoth and the woolly mammoth, went extinct around 13,000 years ago. The difference wasn't in the animals themselves, but in their evolutionary history with humans and the timing of environmental changes they faced. Similarly, Africa retained its mega herbivores like rhinoceroses and hippopotamuses, while North America lost all of its proboscideans, ground sloths, and giant camels. Africa kept its large predators, lions, leopards, hyenas, while North America lost its saber-toothed cats, American lions, dire wolves, and short-faced bears. The animals that survived in Africa weren't necessarily more adaptable or more robust. They were simply the products of a different evolutionary history, one that had prepared them for the challenges they would face. This understanding had profound implications for interpreting extinction patterns elsewhere. It suggested that the naive prey concept was valid, but that naivety alone wasn't sufficient to cause extinction. On islands where humans arrived but environmental conditions remained otherwise stable, megafauna could sometimes adapt quickly enough to survive despite initial population crashes. The Caribbean ground sloths, for instance, survived for thousands of years after human arrival, suggesting that island populations with low human densities could reach new equilibria even with naive prey. But in situations where naive prey encountered humans while simultaneously facing rapid climate change, habitat transformation, and altered fire regimes, the perfect storm conditions identified in North America, adaptation simply couldn't happen fast enough. The animals were hit from multiple directions at once, each stressor compounding the others, creating a cascade that drove populations below recovery thresholds before natural selection could favor survival strategies. The African exception, then, wasn't really an exception at all. It was evidence of what happened when megafauna and humans co-evolved over sufficient time spans to reach equilibrium. The real anomaly was what happened in the Americas and Australia, where the normal processes of adaptation and equilibrium were short-circuited by the speed and complexity of changes. Africa showed what survival looked like. The other continents showed what happened when too much changed too quickly. This insight pointed toward a crucial test case for understanding extinction mechanisms. If human arrival plus rapid environmental change drove extinctions, then you would expect the clearest evidence in places where human arrival was well documented and environmental change was minimal or absent. You would want a place where climate couldn't be blamed, where the timing was unambiguous, where the extinction was rapid and complete. And such a place existed: Australia, a continent where megafauna extinctions had occurred tens of thousands of years before the end of the Pleistocene, during a period of relative climate stability, and within just a few thousand years of the first human footprints on its shores. Australia stands alone among continents as a natural laboratory for understanding megafauna extinction. Here, the variables that complicate extinction narratives elsewhere were either absent or clearly defined. The timing of human arrival is relatively well established. The extinction occurred during a period of stable climate, not during a dramatic glacial-interglacial transition, and the megafauna that vanished were unlike anything that exists today. A menagerie of giant marsupials, enormous reptiles, and massive flightless birds that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. The creatures that roamed Pleistocene Australia would seem fantastical if we didn't have their bones to prove they existed. The largest was Diprotodon optatum, a herbivore that looked like a giant wombat crossed with a rhinoceros. 3 meters long from nose to tail, standing 2 meters tall at the shoulder, weighing up to 2,780 kilograms, Diprotodon was the largest marsupial that ever lived. Despite its imposing size, it was a browser, using its massive jaw and chisel-like teeth to process tough vegetation. Fossil evidence shows it traveled in herds across the interior, following seasonal resources much like modern elephants do. Sharing the landscape with Diprotodon was Genyornis newtoni, a flightless bird that stood over 2 meters tall and weighed around 180 kilograms. Built like a massive emu but more heavily constructed, Genyornis was probably an omnivore, capable of eating both plants and small animals. Its eggs, which have been found at hundreds of sites across the continent, were enormous, larger than those of any living bird, and would become crucial evidence in understanding how these animals disappeared. The predators of this lost world were equally impressive. Megalania, also known as Varanus priscus, was a monitor lizard that could reach lengths of 5.5 meters and weigh up to 575 kilograms. If you encountered one today, it would dwarf the largest Komodo dragons, which themselves are formidable enough to take down water buffalo. Megalania was almost certainly venomous like its modern relatives, and it likely hunted both by ambush and by pursuing wounded prey until blood loss and toxins brought them down. Perhaps strangest of all was Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion. Despite its name, this animal was more closely related to wombats and koalas than to any true cat, but convergent evolution had shaped it into a remarkably cat-like predator, with powerful forelimbs, retractable claws, and bolt cutters for teeth. Thylacoleo was built to bring down prey much larger than itself. Its bite force, reconstructed from skull mechanics, exceeded that of modern lions, and it may have been capable of killing adult Diprotodon. This entire ecosystem, herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, the complex web of relationships that had developed over millions of years of evolution, collapsed rapidly and completely. 88% of Australia's megafauna genera went extinct, the highest rate on any continent. And unlike the extinctions in the Americas, which occurred at the end of the Pleistocene during the transition to the Holocene, Australia's megafauna disappeared much earlier, between approximately 46,000 and 43,000 years ago. The timing is crucial. This extinction predated the Younger Dryas by more than 30,000 years. It occurred during a period when global climate was relatively stable between major glacial cycles. There was no dramatic warming event, no sudden cooling, no massive ice sheet collapse to blame. The climate in Australia during this period was somewhat variable, but not unusually so, and the continent had experienced similar variations many times during the previous hundreds of thousands of years without triggering mass extinctions. What did change, however, was the arrival of humans. The exact timing of human colonization of Australia remains debated, with estimates ranging from 65,000 to 47,000 years ago. But the most reliable archaeological evidence suggests people reached the continent around 50,000 to 47,000 years ago. Within just a few thousand years of this arrival, the megafauna began disappearing. The correlation is striking, perhaps the clearest example anywhere of extinctions following closely on the heels of human arrival during a period when climate cannot be invoked as a primary cause. A groundbreaking 2017 study published in Nature Communications provided compelling evidence for human causation by examining an unusual proxy, fungal spores. Specifically, the researchers analyzed Sporomiella, a fungus that grows exclusively on the dung of large herbivores. In lake sediment cores spanning the critical period, Sporomiella spores were abundant from 150,000 years ago up until approximately 45,000 years ago, indicating healthy populations of megaherbivores continuously producing dung across the landscape. Then, between 45,000 and 43,100 years ago, Sporomiella abundance collapsed, indicating a dramatic decline in herbivore populations. The timing matched the early evidence of human presence almost perfectly and preceded any significant climate change in the region. The researchers concluded that this pattern was better explained by human dispersal across Australia than by climate change. The fungal decline tracked human arrival, not climate shifts. And because Sporomiella requires herbivore dung to survive, its disappearance indicated not just declining megafauna populations, but their effective elimination from the landscape. But did humans hunt these animals? For decades, this question haunted Australian archaeology. Unlike North America with its Clovis kill sites, Australia had produced almost no definitive archaeological evidence of humans butchering megafauna. The correlation between human arrival and extinction was strong, but direct evidence of predation was frustratingly absent. Critics of the overkill hypothesis seized on this gap, arguing that absence of evidence suggested humans and megafauna might have coexisted peacefully until some other factor, disease perhaps, or subtle climate changes not visible in the geological record, caused the extinctions. Then came the Genyornis eggs. At over 200 sites across Australia, researchers have found fragments of burned Genyornis eggshells, often in association with what appear to be ancient human campsites. The eggs themselves were enormous, containing roughly the same volume as 7 chicken eggs, and would have made substantial meals. Chemical analysis of the eggshells revealed scorch marks consistent with cooking fires rather than natural bushfires, providing the first direct evidence of humans exploiting Australian megafauna as food. The eggshell evidence was particularly damning because targeting eggs could have been devastating to Genyornis populations without requiring dangerous direct confrontation with adults. Birds that rely on a small number of large eggs are extremely vulnerable to nest predation. Modern ground nesting birds in Australia, like emus, lose significant numbers of eggs to introduced predators. A human population systematically collecting Genyornis eggs could have driven population declines severe enough to trigger extinction, especially if this harvesting occurred during a period when populations were already stressed by other factors. Some researchers proposed an alternative or complementary mechanism, landscape burning. Indigenous Australians are known to have used fire extensively to manage landscapes, creating patchworks of different vegetation stages that attracted game animals and made travel and hunting easier. This practice, called firestick farming, has been documented historically and likely extends back thousands of years. If early human populations arriving in Australia employed similar burning strategies, they would have fundamentally altered vegetation communities across the continent. For megafauna adapted to specific plant communities, especially browsers like Diprotodon that required woody vegetation, this habitat transformation could have been catastrophic. Regular burning would have favored fire-adapted grasses and shrubs over the trees and dense vegetation that browsing megafauna depended on. Even without hunting a single animal directly, humans could have engineered an ecological transformation that made survival impossible for many large species. This interpretation gained support from pollen records showing vegetation changes coinciding with human arrival. In multiple regions across Australia, the arrival of humans correlates with shifts from fire-sensitive vegetation like rainforest species to fire-adapted vegetation like eucalyptus and grassland species. Charcoal levels in sediment cores increased dramatically, indicating more frequent or more intense fires. The landscape itself was being rewritten, and the megafauna that had evolved in the pre-human landscape had nowhere to adapt to. The concept that emerged from the Australian evidence was what some researchers called imperceptible overkill, a process of extinction so gradual and diffuse that it might leave almost no archaeological trace. Rather than imagining bands of hunters systematically slaughtering every large animal they encountered, you could envision a more subtle process: occasional opportunistic hunting when circumstances were favourable, regular collection of eggs, and widespread landscape burning that slowly degraded megafauna habitat over generations. Each factor alone might not have been fatal, but their combination, acting on naive prey species that had never encountered human hunting or human-modified fire regimes, could drive steady population declines that eventually crossed extinction thresholds. The Australian case then provided perhaps the clearest verdict available for the extinction debate. Climate change couldn't be the primary cause, the timing was wrong, and the climate wasn't particularly anomalous during the extinction window. The extinctions correlated almost perfectly with human arrival. Direct evidence of human predation existed, even if it wasn't as abundant as overkill purists might have hoped. And the mechanism of extinction didn't need to be dramatic or rapid. Steady pressure from multiple human-related factors acting on naive prey populations could accomplish over a few thousand years what a blitzkrieg might achieve in centuries. Yet even this relatively clear case had its complications. Some Australian sites have yielded ambiguous dates suggesting possible human presence before 50,000 years ago, which would extend the human megafauna coexistence period and weaken the tight correlation between arrival and extinction. Some megafauna species may have persisted in refugia longer than others, suggesting more complex dynamics than simple continent-wide collapse. And the absence of abundant kill sites remained puzzling to those who believed hunting must have been the primary driver. What Australia demonstrated most clearly was that megafauna extinctions could occur without dramatic climate change, that human arrival was a sufficient shock to naive ecosystems to trigger collapse, and that the mechanisms of extinction need not be direct or obvious to be effective. The verdict from Australia pointed toward human causation, but it also suggested that this causation operated through complex pathways involving both direct predation and indirect habitat modification. But if Australia provided clarity on timing and correlation, another extinction story would provide perhaps the most poignant chapter in the entire saga, one that revealed both the resilience and the ultimate fragility of megafauna populations. On a remote island in the Arctic Ocean, long after their mainland cousins had perished, the last mammoths on Earth were about to make their final stand. There is something profoundly moving about the story of the Wrangel Island mammoths, a narrative that forces us to reckon with the difference between inevitable decline and tragic accident. While their relatives across the Northern Hemisphere vanished in the tumultuous final millennia of the Pleistocene, one small population managed to endure in isolation for 6,000 additional years, surviving into an era when humans had already built the pyramids of Egypt, when Bronze Age civilizations flourished across Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, when writing had been invented and cities had risen and fallen. These were the last of their kind, and their story reveals as much about survival as it does about extinction. Wrangel Island lies in the Arctic Ocean between the Chukchi and East Siberian Seas, roughly 93 miles long and 35 miles wide, separated from the Siberian mainland by about 85 miles of frigid water. During the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and ice sheets locked up vast quantities of water, Wrangel was connected to the mainland as part of the vast Beringia landmass. Mammoths could walk there freely, part of continuous populations that stretched from Europe to North America. But as the world warmed and ice sheets melted, rising seas gradually isolated the island, cutting off its mammoth population from their mainland relatives around 10,000 years ago. This isolation created what scientists call a refugium, a place where populations can persist even after they've disappeared from the broader landscape. The mammoths trapped on Wrangel found themselves on an island large enough to support several hundred individuals, with sufficient vegetation to sustain them and no large predators to threaten them. While their cousins on the mainland faced the perfect storm of climate change, habitat loss, human hunting, and ecosystem collapse, the Wrangel mammoths had accidentally escaped to a sanctuary where many of these pressures simply didn't exist. The population that survived this isolation event was tiny, When researchers sequenced genomes from 21 woolly mammoths spanning 50,000 years, including several from Wrangel Island, they discovered something remarkable. The Wrangel population had originated from just 8 individuals, a genetic bottleneck so severe it should have spelled doom for any species. With such limited genetic diversity, inbreeding was inevitable. Harmful mutations should have accumulated rapidly. The population should have experienced what biologists call genomic meltdown, a spiral of increasing genetic load and declining fitness that makes extinction unavoidable. But that's not what happened. The Wrangel mammoths not only survived their initial bottleneck, but quickly rebounded to a stable population of between 200 and 300 individuals. And they stayed at roughly that level for 6,000 years, generation after generation, maintaining their numbers on this isolated island, while the rest of the mammoth lineage disappeared into history. If you had visited Wrangel Island 4,500 years ago, you would have seen mammoths grazing on tundra vegetation just as their ancestors had done for hundreds of thousands of years, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they were the last of their kind on Earth. The 2024 study published in the journal Cell that revealed this population history also demolished one of the most popular explanations for their eventual extinction. Many researchers had assumed that 6,000 years of isolation with minimal genetic diversity must have led to genomic meltdown, that the population had accumulated so many harmful mutations it simply couldn't sustain itself anymore. The imagery was compelling. The last mammoths slowly degrading genetically, becoming weaker and less fit with each generation until they could no longer survive. But the genomic evidence told a different story. Yes, the Wrangel mammoths had low genetic diversity, especially in their immune system genes, which are normally highly variable. Yes, they showed signs of inbreeding. But the researchers found that the population had been actively purging highly deleterious mutations through natural selection. The most harmful genetic variants were being eliminated, just as they would be in any healthy population. Moderately harmful mutations did accumulate slowly over time, but at a rate that shouldn't have driven the population to extinction, at least not within the time frame observed. The mammoths' genetic health, while not perfect, was stable. They had adapted to their low diversity situation, and for 6 millennia, this adaptation had worked. Love Delaine, a researcher at the Center for Paleogenetics in Stockholm who led the study, put it bluntly in describing their findings. We can now confidently reject the idea that the population was simply too small and that they were doomed to go extinct for genetic reasons. This means it was probably just some random event that killed them off, and if that random event hadn't happened, then we would still have mammoths today. Just some random event. The phrase is almost anticlimactic, mundane in its implications, yet staggering when you consider what it means. A population that had survived 10,000 years of isolation, that had overcome a genetic bottleneck that should have been fatal, that had endured through climate changes and environmental shifts, that had persisted while civilizations rose and fell on distant continents. This population could have continued indefinitely. The last mammoths didn't die because extinction was inevitable. They died because something happened, some unpredictable catastrophe that a larger population might have weathered, but that this small, isolated group could not. What was that random event? The honest answer is that we don't know, and we may never know. The final mammoth bones from Wrangel Island date to approximately 4,000 years ago, around 2000 BCE. After that, nothing. No gradual decline documented in the fossil record, no signs of increasing stress or deteriorating conditions. Just presence, then absence, like a light switching off. Several possibilities exist, none of them verifiable with current evidence. A disease outbreak could have swept through the population, transmitted perhaps by migrating birds or carried on the wind from the mainland. Small populations are particularly vulnerable to epidemics because they lack the genetic diversity that provides some individuals with resistance to novel pathogens. A single introduced disease could have killed most or all individuals within a generation. An extreme weather event might have been responsible. A particularly severe winter could have killed many individuals directly through cold stress, while also making food scarce or inaccessible under deep snow and ice. A summer of unusual warmth might have brought drought, reducing the already limited vegetation on the island below the threshold needed to sustain the population. Island populations are especially vulnerable to such events because they can't migrate to escape temporary bad conditions. Human arrival is another possibility, though the timing is problematic. Archaeological evidence suggests humans reached Wrangel Island around 3,600 years ago, several centuries after the last dated mammoth remains. But dating Ice Age specimens is never perfect, and it's possible that humans arrived earlier than current evidence indicates, or that the last mammoths actually survived slightly later than their youngest dated bones suggest. A small human population arriving on the island could have hunted the mammoths to extinction within a few generations, especially if they targeted females and young animals. Genetic drift in a small population might have finally caught up with them. While the population had been maintaining itself successfully, every generation carried the risk that chance alone could push harmful mutations to high frequency or eliminate beneficial variations. Over thousands of years, these random fluctuations could accumulate until the population's fitness dropped below the threshold needed for persistence. But the genomic evidence suggests this was unlikely to happen as suddenly as the mammoth disappearance seems to have occurred. The frustrating reality is that we're left with uncertainty, with a mystery that may never be fully solved. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself meaningful. It reminds us that extinction doesn't always have a dramatic cause that we can point to and understand. Sometimes populations that seem secure, that have survived against long odds, that have adapted and persisted and endured, simply vanish. Not because their disappearance was inevitable, but because in a world governed by chance and contingency, even the most remarkable survivors eventually encounter circumstances they cannot overcome. The Wrangel mammoths represent something profound in extinction biology, the difference between necessary causes and sufficient causes. Climate change wasn't necessary for their extinction. They had survived 10,000 years of changing climate on their island. Hunting wasn't necessary. They may never have encountered human hunters. Genetic problems weren't necessary. Their genomes were stable enough to persist indefinitely. Yet something was sufficient to kill them, some combination of bad luck and bad timing that we may never be able to reconstruct. Another isolated mammoth population provides a somewhat clearer picture of how such endings can occur. On St. Paul Island in Alaska, mammoths survived until about 5,600 years ago, roughly 1,000 years longer than their Wrangel cousins. Researchers studying this population discovered that their extinction correlated with a period of rising sea levels and freshwater scarcity. As the island shrank and its freshwater lakes became brackish, the mammoths would have faced increasing water stress. The study suggested that loss of freshwater, combined with the population's isolation and small size, pushed them over the edge into extinction. If this interpretation is correct, it reveals how vulnerable small populations are to relatively minor environmental changes. A large mainland population experiencing freshwater scarcity could migrate to areas with better water sources, but an island population has nowhere to go. Changes that would be survivable annoyances for a large population become existential threats for a small one. The St. Paul mammoths didn't face a catastrophe. They faced a problem that simply had no solution given their circumstances. The Wrangel and St. Paul Island populations together tell us something crucial about the megafauna extinctions more broadly. Size matters, not just the size of individual animals, but the size of populations and the size of available habitat. A species spread across continents with populations in the millions can survive enormous pressures. Local extinctions can be recolonized from refugia. Genetic diversity provides resilience against disease and environmental change, but fragment that species into small, isolated populations, and what was once robust becomes fragile. Each population becomes vulnerable to its own local catastrophes, and there's no rescue from elsewhere when disaster strikes. You could argue that the Wrangel mammoths were doomed from the moment rising seas cut them off from the mainland, not because of anything inherent in their genetics or environment, but simply because they were too few and too isolated to survive indefinitely in a stochastic world. Given enough time, something would eventually kill them. Disease, weather, chance, some combination of factors, and they had no way to recover from whatever that something might be. Their 6,000 years of survival wasn't a reprieve from extinction. It was just a delay in the inevitable. Or you could argue the opposite, that these mammoths proved survival was possible even under dire circumstances, that they adapted and persisted and maintained themselves for 240 human generations, and that their extinction was not inevitable but accidental, that if that one random event hadn't happened, their descendants might still be grazing on Wrangel Island today, a living remnant of the Pleistocene surviving into our own time. Perhaps both perspectives are true. Perhaps the Wrangel mammoths existed in a liminal state between survival and extinction, their fate balanced on a knife's edge where either outcome was possible until chance tipped the scales. Their story doesn't provide easy answers about what killed the Ice Age giants, but it reveals something equally important: that extinction is not always a simple matter of cause and effect, that populations can be simultaneously resilient and fragile, and that the difference between survival and disappearance can come down to luck as much as to any factor we can measure or understand. The mammoths are gone now, from Wrangel and from everywhere else, joining their relatives the mastodons and the ground sloths and the saber-toothed cats in the long catalogue of species that once existed but exist no more. But their genetic material remains, preserved in bones frozen in permafrost, and scientists are now asking a question that would have seemed like pure fantasy just a generation ago. Can we bring them back? After examining the evidence from continents and islands, from tar pits and lake sediments, from ancient DNA and fungal spores, from kill sites and eggshell fragments, what can we finally say about what killed the Ice Age giants? The answer that has emerged from decades of research is simultaneously more complex and more satisfying than the simple either-or propositions that dominated early debates. There was no single killer, no one factor that can bear sole responsibility for the loss of over 65% of the world's megafauna genera. Instead, what we're looking at is a series of interconnected catastrophes, each playing out differently across different continents and time periods, united only by the common thread of human arrival coinciding with environmental change. A comprehensive 2018 study published in Nature Communications examined this question systematically by analyzing population dynamics of humans and 8 different megafauna taxa across multiple regions. The researchers wanted to know whether extinctions correlated better with human population changes or with climate changes, and whether the answer was consistent across species and locations. What they found was striking in its variability. For 3 cases, hunting by humans appeared to be the primary cause of extinction. For 5 cases, climate change seemed to be the dominant factor. And for 1 case, both factors appeared equally responsible. The extinctions, in other words, didn't have a single cause even within the same general time period. This pattern makes sense when you consider the specific circumstances of different species and regions. A mammoth in Siberia faced different pressures than a giant ground sloth in South America. A diprotodon in Australia confronted different challenges than a megalocorus giant deer in Ireland. Each extinction was, in some sense, its own unique event, the product of local conditions and species-specific vulnerabilities interacting with broader continental or global processes. The most recent genetic evidence has added another layer to this understanding. The 2023 Nature Communications study that analyzed genomes from 139 extant megafauna species reconstructed population histories spanning the past 50,000 years. What they discovered was sobering. 91% of these species had experienced significant population declines during this period. The study calculated that total megafauna abundance had declined by 92 to 95%. With similar declines in total biomass and energy turnover. This represents one of the most dramatic reorganizations of large animal communities in Earth's history, comparable in scope to the end Cretaceous extinction that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs. But here's what makes this finding particularly important. The timing and pattern of these declines correlated better with human expansion than with climate change. The researchers identified around 75,000 years ago as the point when human impact became the main driver of megafauna dynamics globally. This predates the terminal Pleistocene extinctions by tens of thousands of years, suggesting that human pressure on megafauna populations was building gradually over a very long period before the final collapse occurred. This gradual pressure might explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the extinction pattern. Why this deglaciation was different from all the previous ones. If you're a scientist investigating megafauna extinctions and you look at climate data alone, you face an uncomfortable fact. The warming at the end of the Pleistocene wasn't dramatically different from previous interglacial transitions. Similar temperature changes had occurred before. Similar habitat transformations had happened during earlier warmings. Yet no mass extinctions had resulted from these earlier events. What was different this time? The answer appears to be cumulative pressure. By the time the final deglaciation occurred, many megafauna populations had already been declining for tens of thousands of years due to hunting pressure, habitat modification through human use of fire, and competition with humans for resources. These populations were already stressed, already smaller and more fragmented than they had been during previous interglacials. When climate change hit on top of these existing pressures, it wasn't acting on healthy, robust populations capable of adaptation. It was acting on populations that were already in decline, already vulnerable, already pushed toward the edge of viability. Think of it like a tree weakened by decades of disease and insect damage. A healthy tree can survive a severe storm, bending but not breaking, recovering and continuing to grow. But a tree that's already compromised, its heartwood rotted and its roots damaged, might topple in winds that a healthy tree would easily weather. The megafauna populations at the end of the Pleistocene were like that weakened tree, and the rapid climate change of the terminal Pleistocene was the storm that finally brought them down. The size bias of the extinctions provides additional evidence for human causation playing a major role. 80% of mammal species over 1,000 kilograms went extinct globally, while smaller species largely survived. Climate change doesn't preferentially target large animals. If anything, you might expect smaller animals with higher metabolic rates to be more vulnerable to food scarcity. But hunting pressure does target large animals preferentially because they provide more food per hunt, and because their slower reproductive rates make them more vulnerable to even modest levels of predation. A deer can replace population losses quickly by having multiple fawns per year. A mammoth, which gestated for nearly 2 years and typically raised only one calf at a time, could not recover from sustained hunting pressure. The geographic pattern too points toward human impact as a critical factor. If climate change alone was driving extinctions, you would expect similar rates of loss across all continents experiencing similar climate changes. Instead, you see a clear inverse relationship between the duration of human megafauna coexistence and the severity of extinctions. Africa, with millions of years of coevolution, lost only 21% of its megafauna. Eurasia, where humans had been present for over 60,000 years, lost 35%. But North America, with only a few thousand years of human presence, lost 72%. South America, where humans arrived even more recently, lost 83%. And Australia, where humans had arrived relatively early, but where the megafauna had no previous experience with any predatory mammals, lost 88%. This pattern strongly suggests that the length of time available for adaptation was crucial. Given enough time, millions of years in Africa's case, megafauna and humans could reach an equilibrium where both persisted. But when humans arrived as a novel threat, especially during periods of climate change and habitat transformation, the combination was fatal. The extinctions weren't inevitable consequences of climate change or of human hunting alone, but of the two factors occurring simultaneously in populations that had no evolutionary experience with either pressure. Yet even this more nuanced understanding leaves questions unanswered. Why did some species survive in some regions while closely related species went extinct? Why did horses go extinct in the Americas but survive in Eurasia? Why did bison survive while mammoths and mastodons disappeared? Some of these differences may have been matters of luck. Which populations happened to be in refugia when the crisis hit? Which happened to have leaders that guided herds away from human hunters? Which happened to have genetic variations that provided resilience against novel diseases? But some may reflect genuine biological differences in adaptability, reproduction rates, behavioral flexibility, or ecological requirements that we're only beginning to understand. The emerging scientific consensus can be summarized in a single observation that appeared in a 2010 study of South American extinctions. This pattern suggests that a synergy of human impacts and rapid climate change, analogous to what is happening today, may enhance extinction probability. The key word is synergy, the idea that multiple factors combine to create effects greater than the sum of their individual impacts. Climate change alone, megafauna might adapt, as they had in previous cycles. Human hunting alone, populations might persist, as African megafauna demonstrate. Fire regime changes alone, animals might shift their ranges, but all three together, happening simultaneously to naive populations without evolutionary preparation. That combination was lethal. This understanding has sobering implications for the present day. We are currently witnessing the fastest decline in megafauna populations since the end of the Pleistocene. African elephants, once numbering in the millions, have declined by over 90% in the past century. Rhinoceros populations across Asia and Africa teeter on the edge of extinction. Even species not typically considered megafauna like lions and tigers have experienced catastrophic declines, and these declines are occurring during a period of rapid climate change and habitat transformation that rivals anything seen during the Pleistocene. The difference is that this time we know what's happening. We understand the mechanisms of decline. We can see the perfect storm gathering even as we help create it. The question is whether that knowledge will make any difference, whether we can break the pattern that has repeated across continents and millennia, or whether we're destined to witness a second great dying of the world's giants, this time with our eyes fully open. But perhaps knowledge does offer hope. If the extinctions weren't inevitable, if they resulted from specific combinations of factors that might have been avoided under different circumstances, then maybe the future doesn't have to repeat the past. maybe understanding what killed the Ice Age giants can help us prevent killing what remains. And maybe, just maybe, the science that has taught us how these animals died can also teach us how to bring them back. When the megafauna disappeared, they didn't simply vanish from the landscape, leaving everything else unchanged. They left behind what ecologists call ghost niches, functional roles in ecosystems that once existed but no longer do, jobs that evolution had spent millions of years refining, but that now remain unfilled. The ecosystems we inhabit today are not pristine wilderness unaffected by human presence. They are wounded landscapes, still adjusting to catastrophic losses that occurred thousands of years ago, ecosystems functioning with crucial pieces missing, like orchestras trying to perform symphonies without entire sections of instruments. A revealing 2022 study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, examined this phenomenon using fossil and isotope data from Hall's Cave in Texas, the same site that had provided insights into climate and vegetation changes during the extinction period. The researchers looked at what happened to carnivore communities before, during, and after the megafauna collapse. What they found was a pattern of ecological reorganization that persists to this day. Before the extinctions, the carnivore guild in the region included saber-toothed cats, American lions, dire wolves, and various smaller predators, each occupying distinct ecological niches. The isotopic signatures from their bones revealed minimal dietary overlap. Each predator was eating different prey or hunting in different ways, reducing competition and allowing multiple large carnivores to coexist in the same landscape. This kind of niche partitioning is characteristic of healthy, diverse predator communities, where evolution has had time to sort out who eats what. After the extinctions, when the saber-toothed cats and American lions and dire wolves were gone, something unexpected happened. The remaining predators didn't simply expand their populations to fill the empty space. Instead, their isotopic signatures showed increased overlap, meaning they were now eating more similar foods and competing more directly with each other. The functional space in the ecosystem, the total range of ecological roles being performed, had contracted. The community wasn't reorganizing to maintain the same level of complexity. It was simplifying, losing ecological possibilities that had existed before. This pattern has profound implications. If you walk through a North American forest today, you might see a landscape that appears wild and complete, with coyotes and foxes and mountain lions going about their business. But what you're actually seeing is an impoverished version of what once existed, an ecosystem that has lost not just species but functional diversity. The roles that saber-toothed cats played, specialists in hunting very large prey, simply don't exist anymore. The niche filled by dire wolves in their massive packs is gone. The ecological space occupied by short-faced bears remains vacant, and the consequences ripple through ecosystems in ways we're only beginning to understand. Megaherbivores aren't just large animals that eat plants. They're ecosystem engineers that shape entire landscapes through their feeding, movement, and waste production. Mammoths and mastodons created and maintained open habitats by knocking down trees and clearing vegetation, functioning as living bulldozers that prevented forests from becoming too dense. Their dung dispersed seeds across vast distances and provided nutrients that fertilized plants far from their original locations. Their trails became pathways that smaller animals used for generations. Their wallows created wetlands that supported entirely different communities of life. When these engineers disappeared, the landscapes they had maintained began to transform. Forests encroached into areas that had been kept open by browsing and tree felling. The mosaic of habitats that megafauna movement had created, a patchwork of different vegetation stages and types, gave way to more homogeneous landscapes. Plant species that had depended on megafauna for seed dispersal found their ranges contracting or fragmenting. Some probably went extinct themselves, though we have no way of knowing which plants these were because they left no fossils. The loss of megafauna also meant the loss of the carrion they provided. A dead mammoth represented several tons of meat that could feed carnivores and scavengers for weeks, supporting populations of predators during lean times when live prey was scarce. These massive carrion pulses would have sustained complex scavenging hierarchies, large predators feeding first, followed by smaller carnivores, then birds, then insects, each group playing a role in recycling nutrients back into the ecosystem. When the megafauna vanished, so did this resource, and the predator communities that had partially relied on it had to reorganize or decline. Modern research has revealed even more surprising connections. A 2023 study found that genetic diversity in shorebird populations declined following the megafauna extinctions, despite shorebirds having no direct interaction with mammoths or ground sloths. The connection appears to be through habitat. Megafauna maintained open grasslands and wetlands that shorebirds depended on during migration. When the megafauna disappeared and these habitats transformed, shorebird populations fragmented and lost genetic diversity, an effect still visible in their genomes tens of thousands of years later. The ecological wounds are deep and persistent. You might think that 10,000 years would be enough time for ecosystems to heal, for new species to evolve to fill empty niches, for communities to reorganize into new stable configurations. But ecological evolution operates on much longer timescales than that. 10,000 years is barely enough time for behavioral adaptations, let alone the evolution of entirely new ecological strategies. The roles filled by megafauna were shaped by millions of years of evolution. You can't replace a mammoth's ecological function in a few thousand years. Some researchers argue that many North American ecosystems exist today in what they call disequilibrium states, temporarily stable configurations that would transform significantly given enough time. The vegetation communities we see now might not be truly stable, but rather transitional states slowly shifting toward new equilibria that reflect the absence of megafauna. The problem is that we're now altering these landscapes so rapidly through climate change, development, and other human impacts that they may never reach those new equilibria. We're treating wounded ecosystems as if they were healthy, managing them based on their current depleted state rather than understanding what they've lost. This understanding changes how we think about conservation. If the ecosystems of today are already impoverished versions of what existed before human impact, then preserving their current state isn't preserving something pristine, it's preserving an already degraded condition. True restoration might require not just protecting what remains, but actively working to restore lost functions, to reintroduce the ecological processes that megafauna once provided. And these insights become even more urgent when you consider what's happening to the megafauna that still survive. Africa's elephants, which avoided the Pleistocene extinctions through their long coevolution with humans, have declined by over 90% in the past century due to hunting and habitat loss. Rhinoceros populations across Africa and Asia number in the thousands where they once numbered in the millions. Hippopotamuses, giraffes, and large predators like lions are all experiencing steep declines. We're witnessing the second wave of megafauna loss, this time happening over decades rather than millennia, but following eerily similar patterns. The parallel is uncomfortable. Like the Pleistocene megafauna, modern large mammals face a combination of pressures: hunting, habitat loss, climate change, and human population growth. Like their Pleistocene counterparts, they're being pushed toward fragmented populations and ecological marginalization. And like the mammoths and mastodons and giant sloths before them, they face the prospect of being remembered only as fossils. their ecological roles becoming ghost niches that future generations will never fully understand. But there's one crucial difference. We know what's happening. We can see the trajectory. We understand the mechanisms of decline and the consequences of loss. We have the knowledge and, theoretically, the tools to change the outcome. The question is whether we have the will. For some scientists, this question has led to a radical proposal, one that would have seemed like pure science fiction just a few decades ago, but that is rapidly becoming technological reality. If we can't save all the megafauna that remain, and if we understand the devastating ecological consequences of their loss, then perhaps we should consider something unprecedented in the history of conservation. Perhaps we should try to bring back what we've lost. Perhaps we should attempt to resurrect the extinct. In a laboratory in Dallas, Texas, scientists are reading the genetic letters that once spelled woolly mammoth. Not from a textbook or a database, but from actual DNA extracted from bones that spent 40,000 years frozen in Siberian permafrost. Using a technology called CRISPR that allows precise editing of genetic code, they're identifying the specific genes that made a mammoth, the ones that coded for shaggy fur and small ears, for subcutaneous fat layers and cold tolerance, for all the adaptations that allowed these animals to thrive in Ice Age environments. And then, methodically, they're inserting those genes into the genome of the mammoth's closest living relative, the Asian elephant. This isn't science fiction. This is Colossal Biosciences, a company founded in 2021 by Harvard geneticist George Church and entrepreneur Ben Lamb. And as of January 2025, it has raised $435 million in funding and achieved a valuation of $10.2 billion. Its stated mission is both simple and audacious: to bring extinct species back to life through genetic engineering. The woolly mammoth is their flagship project, but it's not their only target. They're also working to resurrect the Tasmanian tiger, the dodo, and in partnership with filmmaker Peter Jackson, even the moa, that enormous flightless bird that once stood 12 feet tall in New Zealand forests. The progress has been remarkable. In 2024, the company announced it had created woolly mice, laboratory mice engineered to express mammoth genes for cold adaptation, including genes for specialized hemoglobin that functions efficiently at low temperatures. In October 2024, they revealed 2 dire wolves, given the names Romulus and Remus, though these weren't true dire wolves, but domestic dogs genetically modified to express certain dire wolf traits. A third dire wolf, named Khaleesi, followed in January 2025. More significantly, the company achieved something that had eluded scientists for years. They successfully created induced pluripotent stem cells from Asian elephants, the cellular building blocks necessary for eventually growing mammoth-elephant hybrid embryos. The plan is technically complex, but conceptually straightforward. You start with an Asian elephant whose genome is 99.6% identical to that of the woolly mammoth. You identify the crucial genes that differ between the two species, perhaps a few dozen or a few hundred key changes out of billions of base pairs. Using CRISPR, you edit the elephant genome to incorporate the mammoth versions of these genes. You use these edited cells to create an embryo which you implant into a surrogate mother, either an elephant or, more likely, an artificial womb that the company is developing specifically for this purpose. And approximately 2 years later, if everything works as planned, you get a calf that's part elephant, part mammoth, carrying mammoth genes and exhibiting mammoth characteristics. The company's public timeline is ambitious. They're aiming to produce the first mammoth-elephant hybrid calves by 2028, just 3 years from now. And they claim to be on track to meet this goal, though many scientists remain skeptical that the technical challenges can be overcome so quickly. The difficulties are substantial. elephant reproduction is notoriously complicated. Embryo development in genetically modified animals has high failure rates, and the artificial womb technology required to avoid using endangered Asian elephants as surrogates is still largely theoretical. But perhaps the biggest questions aren't technical, they're ethical and ecological. Even if Colossal succeeds in creating a living creature with mammoth traits, what exactly will they have created? It won't be a true woolly mammoth, not in the sense that the Pleistocene animals were. It will be a hybrid, an elephant modified to express mammoth characteristics, carrying elephant genes alongside mammoth ones. It will have no mother to teach it mammoth behaviors, no social group to integrate into, no ancestral knowledge of how to survive in the environments where mammoths once lived. It will be, in a very real sense, the loneliest animal on Earth, a creature out of time, belonging fully neither to the past nor the present. Critics have raised these concerns forcefully. Beth Shapiro, a paleogeneticist at the University of California, who has worked extensively on ancient DNA, has argued that de-extinction diverts resources from protecting species that still exist and need urgent conservation attention. The money being poured into mammoth resurrection could protect dozens of endangered species from actual extinction, preserving not just their genes but their ecological roles, their behaviors, their place in functioning ecosystems. Oswald Schmitz at Yale has expressed skepticism about our ability to control these technologies. We have this hubris as humans that we can control our technology. I'm not so convinced. There's also the question of where these resurrected animals would live and what role they would play. Colossal's vision includes releasing mammoth-elephant hybrids into Arctic regions as part of a broader effort to restore Pleistocene ecosystems. The theory, promoted by Russian scientist Sergei Zimov in his Pleistocene park in Siberia, is that large herbivores could help preserve Arctic permafrost by trampling snow, allowing cold to penetrate deeper into the ground during winter. This could potentially slow permafrost thaw and reduce release of greenhouse gases from frozen soils. It's an appealing idea, but one with significant uncertainties. Would mammoth-like animals actually perform this function effectively? Could they establish viable populations? What would their impact be on modern Arctic ecosystems that have existed without mammoths for 10,000 years? And yet, despite these valid criticisms and genuine uncertainties, there's something undeniably compelling about the prospect of resurrection. The idea that extinction might not be forever, that species written off as permanently lost might walk the Earth again, challenges one of the fundamental assumptions about the irreversibility of environmental damage. For children who will grow up in a world where extinction rates are accelerating, where species disappear before they're even fully documented, the possibility that some losses might be reversed could be profoundly meaningful. Perhaps the real value of de-extinction isn't in actually bringing back mammoths or dodos, but in what the effort teaches us about genetics, development, and ecology. The techniques being developed for mammoth resurrection, precise gene editing, artificial wombs, embryo development in exotic species, have potential applications for conserving endangered species that still exist. If you can create elephant stem cells for mammoth projects, you can use the same methods to preserve genetic material from critically endangered Asian elephants. The technology being built to resurrect the past might prove most valuable for protecting the present. There's also something to be said for the symbolic power of even trying. The megafauna extinctions represent one of humanity's oldest and most devastating impacts on the natural world. A wave of loss that began tens of thousands of years ago and continues today. Taking responsibility for that loss, acknowledging our role in these extinctions, and making genuine efforts to restore what was destroyed, even if imperfectly, even if incompletely, might represent a necessary step in changing how we relate to the natural world. It's an admission that we owe something to the species and ecosystems we've damaged, that our relationship to nature involves obligations and not just exploitation. But perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves, thinking about mammoths in the Arctic when the technology hasn't yet produced a single viable hybrid. Perhaps the real lesson of the Ice Age extinctions isn't about what we might resurrect, but about what we must protect. Because everything we've learned about how the megafauna died points to the same uncomfortable truth, that we're creating the conditions for a second wave of extinctions right now, that the perfect storm that killed the Pleistocene giants is gathering again in our own time. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Rapid climate change, faster than at any time in human history, habitat transformation and fragmentation on a global scale, human populations expanding into the last wild spaces. And this time, the megafauna don't get millions of years to adapt. They get decades, maybe centuries if they're lucky. African elephants, which survived the Pleistocene through their long co-evolution with humans, are now experiencing population crashes that could lead to extinction within this century. Rhinoceros species that weathered ice ages and climate shifts now teeter on the edge because of poaching and habitat loss. Even species as widespread and adaptable as lions are in steep decline. We know how this story ends if we continue on the current trajectory. We've seen it play out before, continent after continent, species after species. The difference is that this time we can't claim ignorance. We can't say we didn't understand what was happening or didn't recognize the consequences. We have all the knowledge of how extinctions occur, all the understanding of synergistic pressures and tipping points and ecological collapse. We know exactly what we're doing. And maybe that knowledge is the most important thing the Ice Age extinctions can teach us. Not the technical details of how mammoths died or the precise balance of climate versus hunting in each extinction event, but the fundamental understanding that when multiple pressures converge on populations that haven't evolved defenses against them, the results can be catastrophic and irreversible. That ecosystems are more fragile than they appear. That species we assume will always be with us can vanish within generations, that the world can be emptier than we ever imagined. The mammoth bones in museum collections, the saber-toothed skulls, the giant sloth skeletons, these aren't just scientific specimens. They're evidence of how much can be lost, how quickly it can happen, and how long the consequences persist. They're reminders that extinction isn't an abstract concept or a problem for future generations. It's something that has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen unless we fundamentally change our relationship with the natural world. But remembering loss doesn't have to mean accepting defeat. Understanding how species disappeared can inform how we prevent future disappearances. The science of ancient extinctions connects directly to the science of modern conservation. The same techniques used to extract DNA from mammoth bones help us understand the genetic health of endangered elephants. The ecological insights gained from studying Pleistocene ecosystems guide efforts to restore degraded landscapes. The questions we ask about what killed the Ice Age giants help us identify threats to species that still survive. In the end, the story of the megafauna extinctions is our story, a chapter in the much longer narrative of how humans have shaped and reshaped the world. It's a story about what happens when a powerful, intelligent, adaptable species expands into new environments without understanding the consequences of its actions. But it's also a story about learning, about developing the wisdom to match our power, about taking responsibility for our impacts and working to repair the damage we've caused. As you rest tonight, consider that the world you inherited is already diminished from what it once was. The landscapes that seem wild are wounded. The ecosystems that appear complete are missing crucial pieces. The animals that remain are often just fractions of what their populations once were. This might seem like a depressing realization, but it's also clarifying. It means that conservation isn't about preserving some pristine, untouched wilderness. It's about healing damage, restoring function, and rebuilding what we've broken. It's about acknowledging that we've been shaping these systems for tens of thousands of years, and accepting responsibility for doing that shaping more carefully, more thoughtfully, more sustainably. The mammoths are gone from everywhere except the genetic sequences stored in freezers and the memories encoded in our stories. The saber-toothed cats will never again hunt across grasslands. The dire wolves will never howl at dusk. The giant sloths will never reach into treetops. These losses are real and permanent, despite our technological fantasies about resurrection. But the elephants remain for now. The lions persist, diminished but not yet gone. The rhinoceroses still exist in pockets and fragments, and every living megafauna species represents both a connection to the lost world and an opportunity to prevent that world from becoming even emptier. Rest now, knowing that the story isn't finished, that the choices we make about how to treat the remaining giants will echo through millennia, as surely as the Pleistocene extinctions still echo in depleted ecosystems. The questions aren't just scientific anymore, they're moral, ethical, practical. What do we owe to the species we've pushed to the edge? What responsibility do we bear for maintaining the ecological systems that sustain all life? What world do we want to leave to the generations that come after us? Perhaps one day, a child will stand in a carefully managed reserve and watch something that looks remarkably like a woolly mammoth, breathing fog into cold air, returned from an absence of 10,000 years through human ingenuity and technological achievement. That would be remarkable, a triumph of science and a small redemption for ancient losses. But perhaps more importantly, may that same child also stand in places where wild elephants roam free, where rhinoceroses raise their young, where lions hunt across savannas, where the megafauna that survived the Pleistocene extinctions continue to thrive, living ecosystems rather than genetic reconstructions, wild rather than engineered back into existence. The bones in the museum cases are silent now, their stories told as completely as the evidence allows. But their silence speaks. It tells us that extinction is real, that consequences persist, that loss compounds across time. It also tells us that survival is possible, that adaptation works, that populations can recover if given the chance. The mammoths teach us about endings. The elephants can teach us about continuity if we choose to listen, if we decide to protect rather than exploit, if we commit to being the species that learns from its mistakes rather than repeating them across millennia. Sleep well in a world still inhabited by giants, diminished but enduring, waiting to see what we'll choose to do with the knowledge of how their ancestors died and the power to prevent that history from repeating. May the morning bring wisdom to match our capability, and may the giants walk among us for millennia yet to come. The Pleistocene is gone, but its lessons remain, written in stone and bone, and in the empty spaces where magnificent creatures once lived. Good night.